On today's World Insight, crisis in Ukraine with the nationwide martial law in effect and Kyiv severing diplomatic ties with Moscow. As loud explosions hit Ukrainian cities, what's the situation on the ground? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy announced severing diplomatic ties with Moscow after Russia launched the so-called special military operations. Zelenskyy has also declared a martial law amid explosions heard in over a dozen Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol and Odessa. He asked the world leaders to provide aid to Ukraine and help protect it from Russia. Reports said more than 40 Ukrainian soldiers and around 10 civilians have died. The Russian Defense Ministry says it's targeting Ukraine's military infrastructure, not civilians, with precision weapons. Meanwhile, the conflict has sent shockwaves through global markets on Thursday. The ruble falls to a record low of 90 against the US dollar as investors shifted to safe haven assets. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on Russian President Vladmir Putin to bring troops back to Russia, while Putin ruled out plans to occupy Ukrainian territories. NATO was quick to condemn Russia's military operations. Meeting with G7 allies on Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden said, quote, "World will hold Russia accountable," end of quote. For its part, China has called on all parties to exercise restraint, reiterating a policy on safeguarding the sovereignty of all nations.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
Russia cannot feel safe, develop, and exist with a constant threat emanating from the territory of modern Ukraine.
We started putting together an anti-Putin coalition. I have already urged global leaders to slam Putin with all possible sanctions, offer large-scale defense support, and close the airspace over Ukraine for the aggressor. Together we must save Ukraine, save the democratic world, and we will do it.
I strongly condemn Russia's reckless and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, which puts at risk countless civilian lives.
The United States and its allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way.
Now let's loop in our panelists after hearing all the different responses coming from all parties. In Moscow, Professor Alexander Lukin, Director of the East Asian and SCO Studies from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. In Washington, D.C., Anton Fedashian, Professor of History from American University. And with us in Beijing, Rong Ying, Vice President of CIIS, the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I know none of you is representing your specific government, but certainly it's very important to have different views and perspectives here in this discussion. Now, Professor Lukin from Russia, what do you think is exactly the intention of Russia? Do you think it is an invasion?
Hey guys.
I think President Putin said it very clearly in the morning today in his speech. He said that he wanted to, first of all, to add some security or to maintain security of the republics which are now recognized by Russia, which is Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And also, what is very interesting, he said that he wanted denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Well, demilitarization, of course, he said it many times, that Russia would not tolerate the NATO the deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine. And denazification is kind of a new term. So President Putin probably thinks that the Ukrainian government is a Nazi government. Or some organizations in Ukraine are kind of Nazi or right-wing nationalists.
So
and that's
putting the rhetorics aside, let me go to Mr. Rome, because we have some connection problems with Professor Fidashian in Washington. Now, Mr. Rome, China certainly is observing the situation as a third party and seeing sovereignty, territorial integrity of all nations very important. However, the Chinese State Council Foreign Minister Wang Yi also expressed his understanding about the security concerns of Russia together with other countries. And he stressed once again during his conversation with the foreign minister of Russia about the consultation and dialogue to resolve the problems and establish what he called a balanced mechanism for security in Europe. Now, those are abstract words, but Mr. Rong, how is China looking at the latest situation?
Well, indeed, I think China has made very clear that is the situation it does not want to see, because it's raised tension, it's raised a concern of a kind of a conflict that has been that has been tried by various parties to avoid. This is very unfortunate that is happening. And China has doing its utmost to prevent, to play a role, constructive role, to prevent that from happening. And China's positions has been consistent. On the one hand, that it has advocated the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all the countries concerned. And in the meantime, I think it understands very well the situation in Ukraine has a long and complicated history background, and it is a combination of serious factors. So it has the positions, what is happening has to be taken into account of these factors, and China has made it very clear it understands the reasonable concern of security of Russia, and China and also hopes that all the parties concerned would work together to build up that kind of mechanism for Europe, security mechanism for Europe that has been balanced, effective, and sustainable. I think China's position is very clear, consistent, and also very solid.
All right. As you said, Mr. Rong, the Chinese Foreign Ministry is calling on all parties in the conflict over Ukraine to open their doors to peaceful solutions. The ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying on Thursday called for restraint and to avoid escalation. She urged all sides to respect each other's legitimate security concerns and to stay committed to dialogue and cooperation. Listen to this.
I would also like to re-emphasize China's consistent position. We believe that security should be based upon cooperation. The reasonable concerns of all parties should be respected and resolved. We hope that all parties will not close their doors to peace, but will continue to commit to dialogue and negotiation and try to ease the situation as soon as possible without further escalations.
We are talking to Professor Lu Qing from Russia and Professor Rong Ying from Beijing. We hope our connection to Washington, Professor Fidashian from American University, will be soon connected. Let me go to you, Mr. Lu Qing. I want to put the rhetorics aside, otherwise the discussion is going nowhere. Let me know about whether Russia at this point is aware of the consequences, at least being threatened by the quote-unquote West, such as the NATO and also the United States.
Well, I don't speak for Russia, of course, if you mean the Russian government, but I guess that President Putin is, of course, very aware of it. And actually, in his speech 2 days ago, he mentioned that. And he said that we should not be afraid of sanctions because they are applying the sanctions anyway. And whatever we do, whether we are nice or whether we are not nice, we still have got sanctions. So we should not be afraid of it. That's the way he thinks, and so he thinks that it's worth a little hardship for achieving the goals as he sees
What about the
goals.
public in Russia? Where you are in Moscow, for example, how are people responding to the latest actions taken by the government now toward Ukraine? Briefly.
Well, I think the life is normal here in Russia. Well, some people, as far as I know, they want to get some more money from banks, but it's not that difficult. Of course, as you mentioned, the ruble went down a little against the dollar in Europe, well, like maybe, I don't know, 5% or something, but it was going down anyway. So it developed, and but that's what we have to deal with, and I'm quite sure that there will be some hardship. Of course, it's not such a great hardship as we had during the Second World War, for example, but the life would be more difficult a little. But we cannot avoid it, unfortunately.
Now I'm told by my producer that we can talk to now American professor Fedashian. It's good to see you, sir. So tell me more about what do you make of the so-called threats of sanctions made by Washington and the National Security Council meeting being convened Thursday morning, Washington time? Much likely to happen?
Yes, I think it's guaranteed to happen. It was completely predictable. Given the escalation of this crisis to disastrous military proportions. Part of the problem for the West, of course, is that it has been telegraphing what it will do and how severe these sanctions will be. So the Russians have had more than several months. They've actually had several years to prepare for this inevitability. But the fact that the U.S. government is very serious about it, that it's bringing the Europeans along despite whatever tactical disagreements there may be, this, I think, is a certainty. They will not change their minds, and this will deal a fairly heavy blow to the Russian economy. And so this is exactly what should not have happened, a military escalation, because this brings the conflict into the plane of an economic standoff, and that's the aspect that Russia is least prepared for.
Very interesting, Professor Fedashian. I'm sure you know the situations in Ukraine is evolving every minute as we speak. So whether the sanctions against Russia is coming from the so-called sincere support of the West toward Ukraine, or it's coming from the West's agenda toward Russia, that's a very different story, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Wei. And this is one of those narrative dissonances that we have been seeing for the past 7 years around Ukraine, although Ukraine is really ultimately not what this conflict is about for Russia, strange as that may sound today with the tragedy unfolding there. This is a conflict about NATO expansion and the post-Cold War world and the unipolar moment, and the fact that the Russians have been trying to engage the West about NATO expansion and the new Euro-Atlantic security arrangement and have been rebuffed. This does not excuse what started happening within the past 12 hours, but it is an insight into the very complex, complicated, and controversial and now tragic lead up to this story. If the West really wanted to support Ukraine, it would have done so militarily, but of course that would have brought it into direct conflict with Russia, which I think no one really wants. So from looking at it from the Ukrainian perspective, this really is a tragic situation because the Ukrainians have been pulled into the Western sphere of influence, but they've been given no security guarantees to give them the leverage against Russia.
Right.
And, sanctions by definition are not a diplomatic strategy. They are a reaction to something that someone else initiates. So whether diplomacy can be brought back on track, we see. I certainly hope it will within the next days, maybe weeks, certainly months. But the Ukrainians will now be negotiating with the Russians if they choose to sit down from a position of weakness, which could have been avoided even 24 hours ago.
Now, Professor Rong Ying, you've been doing a lot of research over the decades about the Cold War. Some have been making maybe not that appropriate comparison between what is going on right now to, the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that, suggesting whether there are similarities. Now, Professor Rong, do you see we are witnessing the formation of something that likely to become even bigger in the future, given what has been the actions and rhetorics being taken place by different parties?
Yeah, we cannot rule out that possibility, even though I think it's always dangerous to make an analogy like that. I think we have seen already the sort of hardening of the positions. We have seen the rising of tensions. We have seen the brinksmanship of diplomacy. But more importantly, I think we have seen that the one side, a major power that has been pushed to the corner, which is, of course, Russia, by the other side, which who has repeatedly, I think, gone back the promises. So I think even though the end of the Cold War has ended, and the danger is there. So that's why I think countries like China and the international community has calling upon diplomacy, calling upon sort of a reasonableness. We're coming back and calling upon, kind of a dialogue, talks to find a way out. As we have seen that there are chances, there are, I think, opportunities, even though I think the tensions and conflicts are ongoing.
Mr. Lukin, given your knowledge and your insights in Moscow, do you see Moscow is willing with the Russian president to discuss with Ukraine at this point about its future?
It depends on whom you call Ukraine. I don't think that the Russian government wants to discuss anything with the current Ukrainian government. But it will certainly discuss it with the future leaders of Ukraine. And as President Putin said, Russia does not want to occupy it. Russia has just had a peacekeeping operation. Actually not Russia, but 5 countries led by Russia in Kazakhstan, for example, and it withdrew its troops immediately when the situation calmed down. I'm quite sure this will be the case here also, but Ukraine has to become a responsible state with an independent foreign policy, not just an American a territory which is used by Americans for anti-Russian activities, including military activities, which is, of course, the most dangerous part of it. So here I agree with my American colleague, who said that the conflict is not about Ukraine as such. It's a conflict about the entire post-Cold War policy, kind of reckless policy of the West.
Very interesting. We're going to continue our discussion about the latest situation in Ukraine and what's next. Stay tuned. We'll continue our discussions on the crisis after this. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Our topic, the Ukraine crisis. With us once again, Professor Lukin from Moscow State Institute of International Relations, Professor Fidashian from the American University, and in Beijing. Rong Ying from the Institute of International Studies continue our conversation. Professor Fedashian, you know, many say this is a test and also a finding out of truth about what the Biden administration is about when it comes to words matches actions. It is also about whether NATO still has teeth as it claims. It is also about the U.S. role in the NATO vis-a-vis its European counterparts within NATO. So how do you see these very interesting, complex relationships being reflected in the current crisis, Professor?
I think that the current crisis is going to strengthen NATO's resolve, but the tragedy of the situation is that this resolve is internal. It only involves NATO members, and it does not extend to Ukraine. That message was sent very loud and very clear over the past couple of months, both from Brussels, the capital, the headquarters of NATO, and from Washington, D.C., that neither NATO nor the United States by itself, nor any NATO members by themselves outside of the organization itself, will fight for Ukraine. NATO just withdrew from Afghanistan in August. It is still recovering from a 20-year war, which it lost to an opponent that was much weaker militarily, financially, and in almost every other way. NATO is not ready to go to war again, especially not against an opponent as strong as Russia is. Will the United States continue to essentially direct NATO, if not to dominate? Absolutely, it always has. It has the largest military budget and the largest economy by far of all the NATO members. But again, we need to distinguish between what NATO does within its borders. It's bolstering its troops on its eastern members' borders. That's fine, it has every right to do so. But when it comes to the most important thing for every Ukrainian today, NATO is not stepping up. And we'll see what happens after the immediate military, the sharp part of this conflict is over, whether NATO will continue to deal with whatever is left of Ukraine in a way that it had dealt with it before. But there's absolutely no way to predict today how all of that is going to play out.
Let me ask also Professor Lukin, looking at the internal debate going on in the United States, very interesting. Donald Trump said something about the Russian president praising the latter as smart and strategic. And we see there is a lot of political drama going on within the U.S. about an international issue. How do you read that from Moscow?
Well, I don't think that there's big difference between Trump and Biden, for example. The only difference is that Biden's policy is kind of more cooperative towards other NATO members, and Trump was trying to do it alone, more or less. But from the Russian perspective, it doesn't matter, because measures that President Trump took against Mr. Putin, whom he supposedly liked, according to some people, were much worse than we're taking under Biden, actually. So I don't know what Biden is going to do now, but it doesn't matter. I mean, the very basis, the basic ideas of American policy, of world supremacy, of hegemonism, is not, they're similar to, they're shared by the entire American elite. So it doesn't really matter for us who is in power. Somebody should decide in the United States that it's better to talk to Russia than humiliate it. Before that happens, we don't have any prospects of improving relations.
Talking about that, very briefly to you, Professor Lukin, do you see there's any immediate possibility for a summit between the U.S. president and the Russian president? Both agreed earlier, of course, was canceled after the military operation.
You never know. On the surface, of course, everyone is very much dislike Mr. Putin. But you know, politics is a very realistic thing. In some cases, if the danger is real, then it kind of encourages people to talk. So I think some talks in some time could happen, actually.
Very interesting. Professor Rong Yin, we are wrapping up our show, but it's very important also to ask you, because China is part of the UN Security Council Permanent 5 and also has been declaring some kinds of strong strategic relationship with Russia, also strategic partners with Ukraine, of course. And China has been having some interesting relationship, to say the least, with the United States. How China is going to measure and assess the latest situation and take appropriate step and stance. Very interesting to the rest of the world, Professor Rong.
Yeah, I think China has made it very clear it would determine or decide its positions based on the right and the wrong of the nature of the issues, and it has been very consistent. It has been, I think, called upon for the respect of the principles and purposes of the UN. That's why I think we have said that China would like to see the situation calming down, would like to see dialogues, diplomacy would resume, and would like to see security would be managed in the way that has been by pursuing the principle of indivisible. In other words, security should be pursued not at the expenses of the others, rather for the common concept of security. That's why I think NATO, China opposed the expansion of NATO, because this is the kind of thinking left over by Cold War. And we're in a new century where we're having a new kind of challenges, and we have to pursue a new concept of security.
All right, those are interesting topics, certainly further need to be interpreted in the future. Rong Yin, Anton Fedashian, Alexander Lukin, thank you so much, gentlemen, for sharing your insights with us in this ongoing story about the Ukraine crisis. Really appreciate that. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us.